I'd like to welcome Björn Arvidsson, and you're the Head of Policy and Communications at Roche. Welcome.
Great, thank you. I'm very honored to be here as well, and it really raises the expectations when you are to talk about the future of healthcare, right? So I'm a very curious person, and that means I read a lot, and I reflect a lot, and I extrapolate that into predictions. So this is not very scientific, but I hope that it will inspire you at least, and that you can see the opportunities of what the healthcare could look like in the future. One of the challenges by looking into the future is actually that we overestimate the change in the short-term view. We get too eager and frustrated, but in the long term, actually, we underestimate the change. And that means that we seldom see the revolutions that we're actually in the middle of. And that is a problem. And it's supposed to be visualized by this graph. It has no numbers on the axis as well, but it's just to give you a visualization of actually how we work as people. Another challenge is, of course, that we often touch upon the subject of science fiction. And science fiction is often things that we either don't understand or we think is impossible somehow. But I also think that science fiction actually is a good inspiration for where we're going. And there are lots of examples of that, and I'll just mention a few to you. And for instance, the idea of a credit card was actually coming up already in 1888. But it was not until 1950 that the first credit card, the Diners Club, actually came into broader use. And also, like for instance, the video conference that was mentioned in Hugo Gernsback's book in 1911, but actually we didn't have televisions by then, and Skype didn't come for much later. So it's a good inspiration because we can see where we're going by thinking about things that we don't have. Other things are, of course, very popular now. It's electric cars. The idea came up in 1969, for instance, that having vehicles that were supposed to be rechargeable somehow. There are also things that actually we're really not there yet. One of the things, this is meant as a bit of a joke, I don't know if you watch Star Trek, and in Star Trek actually they have a tricorder, which is a kind of a tool that you can use to do sensor things or analysis, calculations, and also recordings. And there are actually 3 different kinds of tricorders. It's one for the engineers, one for the medical staff, and one for the explorers. But they're very similar. The other thing is, of course, cryonics. Of course, George Lucas is not the person who invented cryonics. This is just because the picture is from Empire Strikes Back. But we do that today. We actually freeze people down. And there are body banks in the United States and South Korea, for instance, where a lot of people actually are on ice. The problem, though, why it's not there yet, is that we don't really know how to unfreeze them. What I'm trying to say with the science fiction part is that I think we need to think about the impossible more often. So that will actually drive the whole idea of innovation. I will, during this short speech, mention 3 major trends that I see. The first one is that everything will be upgraded, and it goes extremely fast. And an effect of the upgrading is, of course, that it causes change. We need to change, the environment will change, and that means that we need to be adaptive to that change. And the speed of change is increasing all the time, which means that our alignment or adaptation to this speed of change also need to increase. The other thing is, of course, that everything will be smart. Everything around will be smart, and it will be connected somehow. But an effect of that is also, of course, that it enables surveillance and monitoring, which is very hot topic in May now when we have the GDPR discussions coming up. And also, everything will become predictable. And if it's predictable, it can also become preventable. But we also need to make sure that we can filter the information that we get. Otherwise, there will be just a lot of information, and very few people that actually can do something with it. And to give you an example of that, I think we need to start in one end, and that end is actually in accelerated growth. Many people talk about exponential growth, and that is, of course, what you see when something doubles up all the time. But as long as it's not linear, that it accelerates faster than the linear growth, we can call it accelerated growth. And to give you a few examples of that, cell division is accelerated growth. One cell becomes 2 cells, and 2 cells becomes 4 cells, and so on. But also learning is an accelerated growth. The more you know, the more perspectives you have, the more languages you speak, the more easier you can adapt to new knowledge and actually increase the amount of knowledge that you have. And very often we talk about the computational power as the exponential growth. And then we talk about, of course, the Moore's law. Gordon E. Moore was the founder of Intel, the manufacturer of processors for computers, and he actually stated a prediction in the 1960s where he said that the amount of transistors on a chip will double with a certain time period. And after a while, they actually had to revise this idea and prediction that he had, so it changed to the amount of transistors on a chip per cost will actually double over a certain period of time. And it actually, you can see this curve, which actually has been since he mentioned it very early, and all the computational power that has gone through time. I mentioned that one of the problems were that we really don't see it in the future, because the future is accelerated as well. And the human brain is actually not skilled enough to see anything other than a linear growth or a linear development. And that means that our idea of where we'll be is actually very wrong. And this beautiful picture is actually showing that, where we will end up while where we think we will end up, and that creates a growth surprise factor. If you think of it, the difference between a linear growth and an exponential growth is quite, it sounds semantic, but it is not actually. If you think about, you do a linear change in 30 steps, it's 30 steps. But if you do an exponential change in 30 steps, it's more than 1 billion steps. So it's a huge difference in the end. And just to do the comparison with my earlier graph, it's very similar. We just, in this nice graph, we don't have the overestimation part. I also think it's very important to know where you come from when you look into the future. And for instance, before Wikipedia, most of us in this room actually remembers the time before Wikipedia. But we can also see that even if it wasn't that long ago, we're very dependent on that kind of databases and knowledge bases today. And the same thing goes for smartphones. I had my first smartphone, I think it was in 1994. It's not that long ago. And it has developed a lot since. You know, the smartphone that you have in your pocket is much, much more powerful than the computers were 10 or 15 years ago. And the same thing goes for the internet itself. Most of us remember also the modems that we had, that you actually, even in the 80s, you could connect to a bulletin board and share some information, but the speed of change has come very, very fast. Just as a side note, I think it's interesting with the Wikipedia thing, and the picture shows this encyclopedia. Actually, a side story to that is that when I was a child, my parents wanted to give me a good start of my future. So they actually subscribed to Bra Böckers Lexikon. This was 25 or 24 books with all the collected information in the world. Fantastic, right? You could have it in your shelf. And you got one of these books every half a year, which means that after 12 years, you had all the information in the world. And I could bring it with me when I moved from home. And I actually did. For a long time, I had it in my shelf. And a lot has changed since, right? Another thing that's a good example of accelerated growth is actually the Human Genome Project. This was a project that was the geneticist community actually started in the 1990s, where they wanted to map the human genome. So for a period of 15 years, they were to actually make a mapping of one human genome. The funny story with that is that after 7.5 years, the half of the time, they had actually only mapped 1% of the genome. But they ended up 2 years in advance, actually. So only after 13 years, they had a full mapping. So that's a very typical example of the accelerated growth itself. The life expectancy is not really an accelerated growth, but it's an interesting growth, though, for the topic and subject that we talk about. Sorry, Do you know that since the last 160 years in the Western world, we have had the same pace of increase in life expectancy? It's actually 1 year every 6 years increase. That means for every day that you live, the average life expectancy increases with 4 hours. But I expect it to actually increase very soon with all the technology and innovations that we have. One funny thing with that is that in Sweden, when we decided when you were able to retire from your work, the average lifespan was actually 59 years. So it was quite easy for the economists to calculate, to get the equation to flow. Today, the life expectancy in Sweden is actually 82 years. And with this pace, a child born today will have a life expectancy of over 100 years. So that's quite interesting. And we can't talk about exponential growth without talking about the information that's also increasing exceedingly fast, actually. At the moment, the amount of information that we create in the world is doubled every 18 months, approximately. I think it says 30 months here, probably. 5 months? 5 minutes. Okay, sure. And that means that we create as much information in 18 months as we have done during the whole period of our existence. And that's quite interesting. So there are a lot of examples, actually, what I'm trying to say, where we upgrade, where we collect a lot of data, and with this data we can create a lot of health and healthcare. Imagine what we can do with the gene sequencing. I mentioned the Human Genome Project. What they could achieve at 2003, when they actually finished the project, just 15 years later, where we are today, you can do this within 1 day for less than $1,000. While the whole Human Genome Project actually took 13 years and cost $3 billion. And it goes faster and faster. There was actually a Kickstarter campaign just a few months ago for a small sequencer that you could have in your home. Another thing that's quite interesting is that with your next iPhone, you will open it up by having a photograph of your face. Imagine how much information you will actually collect. How often do you open your phone? 1 per day. A few hundred times, right? Imagine having high-resolution pictures, a few hundred of those per day, collected by someone, where you can actually see the quality of your skin or hair, or how your pupils look, and anything like that. Brain-computer interfaces, it's not an experiment anymore. There are actually commercial tools for that, and we can learn a lot. I read this article a few weeks ago where you actually can have a very simple, headband, and you can, with that, control drones that could fly around the room. You just have to calibrate it according to your brain, where you think about, go upwards, go forwards, go backwards, land again, and it's calibrated, and you can do it. Imagine how much data that collects, how much information you get on how the brain works by doing that. At the same time, we have Internet of Things. We have nano-sized machines. In 2016, the Nobel laureate in chemistry actually were achieved for nano-sized machines. These are small machines that can communicate outside of the body, but circulate in the bloodstream, for instance. And they actually also can be printers. Molecules can print other molecules in your body. I think that's very interesting. With all this data that we actually collect, if we do it faster and faster, we also need to integrate it, of course. We can't have data in different databases, because they make very little sense in a silo. But when you start to integrate it, you can find, a lot of correlation between the data that can actually give us a guidance of the predictions that we can make for our health. As you can see, there are numerous of tools in existence today. This is nothing that is science fiction. These are things we talk about today. Epigenetics, CRISPR-Cas9, where we can cut and edit your DNA in a living host, or artificial intelligence, or augmented or mixed reality. We can do that today. And when we have all this knowledge, I think it's quite interesting, because suddenly we start to see disease and death as a technical problem. And technical problems can be solved with technology. And what I'm trying to say, we're very good at technology, so we can probably solve a lot of these challenges that we will face. If you Google healthcare, this is the kind of pictures you get. Do you recognize it? Does it feel like healthcare? If you Google on health, this is what you get. Quite different, right? And I think that's very important to reflect upon, because how we see health and how we see healthcare is very different. And if we compare those, I think, for honestly, that we spend less than 5% in the Swedish healthcare on health or prevention, health prevention, and more than 95% on, reactive healthcare. And I think I'm actually very optimistic when I say 5%. The fire department, their major role is not to put out fires. They spend 80% of their time educating and preventing fires. Imagine healthcare that has the same kind of vision. I think that will be quite interesting. I think also the kind of technology that we're facing and that we can use today can actually help us to do that. There is a saying, it might not be true, but I like the story. And the story says that a while back in China, doctors were reimbursed or paid as long as their patients were healthy. If any of their patients actually got sick, they didn't get paid until the patient recovered. And doctors turning to surgery to have an intervention with the patient were seen as inferior doctors by the others, because actually the doctor had failed somehow in order to be able to take such a drastic manner to help the patient. If it's true or not doesn't really matter, but I think the whole idea of it is quite intriguing. Because for me, health is wealth. Tack.